You're listening to Win-Win, an entrepreneurial community with your host, Ben Wolf.
And welcome to the Win-Win podcast. This is your host, Ben Wolf. As always, I'd like to welcome you here today. Ask you also to pause. Please stop for a second, leave a review, follow, like, comment, so that the algorithms that govern the platforms and systems on which you are either listening to or watching this will make it available to more people. I really do. Leave an Apple Podcast review. Please do us a favor. Do everybody else listening to this a favor, and pause and do that. I appreciate it. All right. So with that, I want to introduce our guest today on the topic of the virtues of being a generalist. And our guest today is a fractional COO and integrator for companies running on EOS through his company, Vivid Path. He is also a System and Soul certified coach. You can find out more about him at vividpathconsulting.com. And with that, I give you Mark Scrimenti. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Ben. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
As am I. But before we do that, I want to ask you, as I ask all of my guests, if you don't mind giving us and the listeners and viewers a quick 2-minute background, so sort of tell us sort of where you came from and how you got to where you are now, and such that you're speaking about the kind of topic we're talking about today.
Right. All right. Well, it's the path seems circuitous in retrospect. In the moment, it seems random, and then you look back, it's like it kind of makes sense. You see how each step led to the other. So I think there's lots of paths to being a generalist, and mine happened to be from the liberal arts side of the spectrum, and English major in college, philosophy minor, and I think it's a great background for being a generalist. We can talk about more about that later. But I have a master's degree in professional writing. Fun fact. And I had to find a way. Yeah, I had to find a way to engage in the marketplace, and the space that took me was tech, and I found my way through tech. So that's how I started my career. And I started as a tech writer, moved into consulting, then got into the startup world. This is all sort of early web era, like this brand new thing called the World Wide Web was coming, and it was here, and it was really exciting. This new medium and technology that was going to transform the world. It was very exciting. So I worked at startup, and then I worked for myself and learned a lot of stuff along the way. I learned how to code and all that. I can talk more about that later. But I think then, for 12 years, I was in one place in online retail. We sold musical instruments. You see a guitar in the background. I play it poorly. Yet another thing that a generalist would do, right? Play an instrument poorly. Jack of all trades, master of none. We'll get to that, though. There's more about that. And then in online retail, that's where I found my place in operations. I think I didn't expect to be there. Came at it through marketing at that point. But I really discovered I love building things, and that's what operations is all about. And there's a lot of synthesizing and team building and a lot of people. There's a huge people component to it, as you know. And so I grew as a leader there, and the company grew, had a lot of success while I was there. And that kind of, the one missing piece, I would say, is the why, purpose. And that was, frankly, what was missing from that company. We did well, but without a why or a sense of purpose, there's only so far you can go. And I realized I need that extra motivation, the purpose. And so now that I've been on my own for a few years, 3 years as a fractional, and then doing the coaching, doing one-on-one coaching as well, it's really my opportunity, my why. I found my why in giving back to people and helping people do what I've learned to do operationally in terms of building the systems, processes, teams, and so forth to grow a company, hopefully a purpose-driven company that actually knows why they're doing what they're doing, because that's without that, I think you eventually falter and probably die.
Right, and I appreciate that. And that phrase that you used before, jack of all trades, master of none, it's conventional wisdom. Everybody knows it, but not very often do people talk about the quote unquote virtues of being a generalist. So what does that phrase that you use mean?
Yeah. Well, I think the virtues of being a generalist, at some point, I talked about purpose, and this built into that phrase is master of none. And that's where I dispute. I think as a true generalist, when you find yourself as a generalist, and truthfully, I think it takes some years of experience and maturity to specialize in being a generalist. And so that's where we find ourselves today, or where I find myself today, is specializing in being a generalist. So what does that mean? Because as we seek mastery in what we do, because ultimately that's what drives us. You want to be good at what you do. Um, at this level, though, so I mean, you can be a generalist at different levels. If you're a young, immature, inexperienced generalist in a leadership position, that's probably not going to go well. And there, we can talk about that, like the stages of a company, and when a generalist versus a specialist is required in what circumstances. But once you get past that, as rise in leadership and rise in the ranks, so to speak, in a hierarchical structure, your purview becomes broader, and the broader your purview, the more your generalist background is useful, to the extent that at this point now you are managing, you are running, you are directing a very diverse team of different business functions, different personality types, different communication styles. We're talking about business people, marketing people, tech people, designers, customer service people, all different kinds. So the broader your skill set and the broader your experience in all these areas, and with all these types of people, the better in terms of your leadership. I think leaders, good leaders, great leaders, tend to be more generalists. And I think you may start as a specialist, but as you become, as your responsibility becomes broader, you need to be more of a generalist, to be able to work effectively and to synthesize all of these different activities and people. And so so the virtues of being a generalist, I think, the ability to do that, and that is something that you develop over time. Now, you also need depth. You need sufficient depth across these different categories, functions, in order to be effective. But you don't need to be an expert, for example. So you need to know something about marketing if you're a COO, and either that function falls underneath you, or that you have a CMO who's at your level, and you need to work together effectively. But I see things holistically anyway as a system, and they all interact, they all interconnect. So you really need to know something, especially at the root level. And there's also, and I could go on about this, and I am aware I've already talked for a while, but the point here is that there's kind of like, you get to that meta level, like as a generalist, like where it's no longer about an individual subject matter area or business function, but it's about that meta level above that, sort of an abstraction layer where you're trying to where you're thinking about how these things work together and synthesizing them, and that becomes sort of your domain of expertise, the
Right.
synthesis, the integration.
Right. And I love that phrase you used before, the specializing in being a generalist.
Mhm.
That's a great phrase that you said. What are some examples so we can understand of like what do you mean by a generalist? What is a generalist? Like, because it's sort of a general term, right? So
Yeah,
or generic. So
yeah,
what do you mean? What do we mean when we say generalist?
yeah. And it's funny, I can't remember if you originated that term or if I did, because I'm not even sure uh where it came from. I'm not even sure what I think about the word generalist. I think a generalist, but to answer your question, because it has a negative connotation, and it's almost like we need to rewrite the narrative about that. Um, but to answer your question, how do we rewrite the narrative? I think a generalist again has broad knowledge of a lot of different areas and needs sufficient depth. So for me, for example, I've served in different roles. I've served in marketing. I've served in, creative direction. I've done coding. I've learned how to code. A lot of it is DIY. A lot of it is the DIY spirit, the entrepreneurial spirit, which is different generally from your organization person, your corporate person, where
Mhm.
you kind of get plugged into a spot. So if anyone who's grown up in sort of an entrepreneurial environment or had the opportunity to be in one, and I consider myself privileged to have had that opportunity, which I can talk more
Mhm.
about. You kind of learn to do things yourself, and it doesn't make you an expert necessarily, but that's how every entrepreneur starts out, right? They all start out. It's interesting. I'm going on a little tangent here, but it's related. Have you ever read The E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber?
I started it, did not finish it.
Okay, did you not like it?
No, maybe I just didn't get into it as much. I don't know, but I
Okay,
know
yeah,
it's a classic, very highly influential book
right,
on
right. Well,
visualization and
yeah, reason enough not to read it. Like if for some reason that rubs you the wrong way, but I was kind of resistant to it at first, but I read it and it's like, man, this is a really great book. And it's really kind of the foundation for a lot of these business operating system concepts where he's looking at, the franchise model. Like how do you standardize things so you can reproduce them? Like even if you're not planning to be a franchise, you got to think like a franchise, and that's how you actually build for scale. He starts out that way, and he's a good writer, so it's well written. But my point there is that he's like every entrepreneur starts out typically as a specialist, like whether you're a
yeah,
baker or a developer or a bricklayer, you've got a specialty, but then very fast you have to become a generalist. And so there's it's interesting, like becoming a generalist, starting out as a specialist who becomes a generalist, and depending on the stage of your company and the stage of the growth, you kind of have to shift back and forth. And there's times when, you need that generalist and there's times when you need that specialist. So back to your question about the virtues of being a generalist, to have the ability, I think that flexibility, adaptability to kind of bounce around, learn different things, absorb them, learn them well enough to do them yourself, and then find somebody you can hand them off to who can do them better than you. But at least, okay, now I understand that thing. I now
right,
understand how it works. I know how to talk to this person. That's one of the key things. Like, let's say developers, classic thing. It's, if you don't know anything about technology or if you're mystified by technology, it's a black box. And the developer will tell, oh, we can't do that. It's like, and if you and if you're like, oh, if you take them at their word, it might, I mean, I'm not saying that, this happens all the time, but it may well be, no, they just don't want to do that, or it's hard, it's too hard, or they don't know how to do that. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but you need to
right,
have like the confidence and sufficient knowledge to be able to question that. So some of that is
right.
personality and you just, confidence and so forth, leadership skills. Some of that is just knowledge, and so your ability to learn. So going back to being a liberal arts major, that was one of the blessings, I think, of having a liberal arts education. We could talk about education too, but because you're studying a wide variety of
Right.
fields. I think if I were in college now, I don't know if I'd have the luxury of doing that. The way that, with college being so expensive, I might want to
Mm.
take something more practical, get something more career oriented if they offered
Right.
such a course. But you're studying physics, you're studying biology, you're studying English, philosophy, political science, and you're picking up mental models along the way. Like for me, like Hegel's dialectic. This is from philosophy. Do you know that? Do you know that like thesis, antithesis, synthesis? It's this
Heard those
idea,
terms.
right? But it explains. It's a useful mental model that you can take with you for the rest of your life and apply in different situations,
Uh-huh.
and it can be sort of in his case, it's sort of a model, a dynamic model for how the world works, how ideas evolve over time. Marx adapted it, to dialectical materialism, his understanding of history. So my point is, things like the bell curve or the scientific method, you pick these things up as a
Right.
liberal arts major, and eventually, if you're
Interesting.
fortunate, you find a way to use them. Everybody tells you. I remember when I was in college, people said, being a liberal arts major, that's going to be valuable in the future. And I think that was based on this um, vague notion that, it was the digital age, it was the dawning of the information age, and everybody knew computers are going to be important. This was before the internet, though. So they didn't even see the internet coming or the web coming. But they're like, somehow this is going to be applicable. The thing that they didn't realize is that it probably was decades later before some of this stuff actually became useful.
Right.
And I had to in the meantime, you have to make a living, and you have to figure out how you can, apply what
Right.
you're able to do. Um,
But I see what
yeah.
you're saying about, about some of that liberal arts
So there was
attitude,
a
or having
lot
a
there, and
broad,
yeah,
yeah, having sort of a broad way of looking at things, and that you come up through, obviously through specialization or multiple specializations, eventually being able to become an effective generalist, meaning like a manager over multiple sub departments, or a COO, let's say, over or a CEO over multiple functions within a
right.
business. But let's go to the other side here. What happens in businesses, or what have you seen happen? What's some, story example, something you've seen happening where there's no generalist, whatever that means. Everybody's a technician, everybody's a specialist, everybody's a SME, subject
Yeah,
matter expert in something. And what have you, I guess if you could tell me about that, tell me about the antithesis before we get
yeah,
to the
right.
synthesis of what happens when you lack a generalist in a business.
I saw what you did there. Yeah. So, well, I think a kind of myopia can happen, but I think it's often it's often at the leadership level. Like if somebody comes up a technician, um, and again, that's how they usually start. They they have specialized knowledge, but they may not be a good manager of people. That's a common one, right? People quit their jobs because they don't like their boss. And why don't they like their boss? Their boss isn't really effective as a manager. So a lot of, going back to the E-Myth, if a lot of entrepreneurs or founders are first technicians, with specialized knowledge, if they don't kind of sufficiently make the jump to being more of a generalist, like you look at some of the best ones, like Bill Gates. I mean, Zuckerberg, whether you like him or not, I mean, he's made the jump, from being, a brilliant, kid programmer to being a CEO. So there's plenty of other stories like that, but not everybody can do that. So or they can only do it so far. So you may be able to do that to get your company to a certain point, $1 million in revenue, $2 million in revenue. But you always meet these inflection points where, okay, beyond that, I have now tapped out or we have tapped out our internal expertise, personally as the leader, the founder, the leader, but also with in-house. Like, we need to bring in somebody else who can take us to the next level. And interestingly enough, that could be a specialist at that point. So for example, I can give you an example. Like, one would be with HR. So when I started out at the online retailer, we didn't have an HR person. We had an office manager. And when I took over the call center, we had over 100% turnover.
Hmm.
The year before. Yeah, we hired 30 people, we lost 31. I remember
Oh
that
my
number
gosh.
distinctly. Yeah, it's
That is
terrible. And
insane.
and
Wow.
it
And
it,
not
it
even
points
with like
actually.
two people, it's like 30 people.
No, it's a lot, right? And so that actually points to two different examples that are kind of related to your question. So the person who came before, here's a case of, it's almost like the inverse of what you're talking about. A specialist who's overgeneralized for the role. So, we had this bad call center turnover problem. So, and I had just started the company. I'd been there for about a year. And so we ended up hiring a guy with 30 years experience in a very large call center, AT&T. He worked for AT&T, like as big as they get. So
Right.
multiple call centers. And we thought, okay, well, surely this person knows everything about running a call center. And he interviewed well, and he talked about servant leadership and all kinds of things. So, okay, that's our guy. And it was a miserable disaster because um, we kind of overfitted on the specialization. Oh, call center, we have run a call center, it's a fit. Well, it turned out it wasn't a good cultural fit predominantly. we were a call center of young musicians, 20-something musicians, everybody's tattooed, engaged ears, and just a very artistic culture. And he's coming from a very corporate culture, jackets, and he's older and just did not mesh, did not connect with the people, did not respect them. They didn't respect him. It was his leadership style was arbitrary, a lot of favoritism. Um, Despite talking about using data to run the call center, he didn't use it. He made kind of arbitrary decisions. So anyway, bad fit. But that's a case, what do you call that exactly? It's almost like here's a specialist, but what we really needed. So well, I ended up taking over the call center, and that's how I got into operations. That was my first project. Like, fix it. Like, well, okay, I've never done this before, but I'll figure it out. And unfortunately, we had a lot of data to look at, but it was also talking to people. It was sitting down, taking people out to lunch in groups of 6, and what do you like? What don't you like? What's wrong? How can we make this better? Just listening, sitting with them, watching what them do, learning what they do. Again, here's the learning piece, so we could talk to them effectively, and then start re-engineering things. And we changed everything, and over time, we managed to change the culture, so it became a place where people stayed long term, recruited their friends, became like family. But that took time, and it was a lot. The other thing I was talking about HR with the turnover, it's like at that point we realized, look, we need a progressive discipline policy, because think about this. I'm in Illinois, and it's a worker friendly state, which I think is a good thing. But what that means is that it's very easy to get unemployment, whether like it's just easy. So like all those people are going on unemployment, and that you pay for that, so your unemployment tax, our unemployment tax went up from 2 to 10% in 1 year. And it's a 3-year period, so you get 3 years to turn that around. It's like, okay, we need to turn this around. Let's get a progressive discipline policy in place, because we don't know. This is where you need a specialist. It's like, okay, I don't know about HR. I don't know about HR law. This is the kind of thing that, you need a specialist for. And so she came in, and we rewrote our handbook, but we came up with a progressive discipline policy, where you give the warning, the written warning, the second warning, and all of that. If you don't do that, you cannot challenge unemployment. That's sort of the instrumental reason for doing it, but it's just the right thing to do also, right? And it was foundational to our culture. So there's a case where we had reached a point in our growth, or at that point we were struggling, where we needed to bring in a specialist. Interestingly enough, though, once all these things were established, we brought in another generalist, because okay, now we've got the rules established. We don't really need an HR professional necessarily. It's not that I wouldn't have kept one. She ended up leaving, but the person that we replaced her with, and I probably would have hired another HR person, frankly, but the CEO was like, he had some sort of HR bias. I don't know. But point being that we didn't really need one, because we had already, her expertise had helped us establish what we needed to establish. And then that could be managed or executed by more of a generalist, who was then again more of an office manager.
Right. Going away from business for a second, another thing that this makes me think of, and maybe it was the liberal arts conversation from before, but in the world, you see a lot of people are big experts in virology or or philosophy or history or whatever. But there's certain very special people that are like I think they call them polymaths. I don't even know where that word comes from, but they seem to just, I don't know, maybe they could just go through periods, or they just obsessively like learn about science and learn about philosophy, learn about history, and and all different subjects. And so I don't know. I mean, you have what are some good examples? I mean, you have Jordan Peterson, or you have
Ben
I
Franklin.
don't know. You just talk to certain people that like, I don't know, almost any topic. Like they just have what seems like a deep knowledge about, there could be quoting philosophers like you were a second ago, and then they're talking about science or biology or something.
Mhm.
So I don't know what do you think makes people like that, or like what's the differentiating factor that creates people who are generalists in the world? Like, because
Yeah,
most people are more specialists and whatever. They know one thing,
yeah,
I mean, if or none, but I mean, if they know
right.
anything, it's one thing.
Yeah.
And
Well, it could be ADHD, quite honestly. Uh,
because they have that obsessive gene in ADHD.
well, okay. So I'll be honest with you. I have ADHD, so I'll
I
yeah,
mean, me too.
do you? Okay. Quite honestly, Ben, I suspected that, and so I'm glad that we can talk about it openly here on your
Yeah.
podcast.
You have to
There's no
listen to a
shame in
past
it.
episode, and everybody out there, you should listen to a past episode with Peter Shankman, author of Faster Than Normal,
Mm,
from a couple months ago. I don't know if you've seen that book, but he came on the podcast and spoke about kind of the superpower brain of people with ADHD. So
right. I will listen to that, and I've heard that, right? And so it can be your superpower. And the way I would just, but like anything, right? It's always two sides of the same coin. Your greatest strength is often your greatest weakness, and you've got to adapt to that. My old boss and I, he was a real brilliant guy. PhD, ABD dropout, and math and statistics background, who was like really a great modeler, like a data modeler, data analyst. So there's that whole thread I can get to, but we would talk about like having the right pathology for the job. Like if you're I mean, if you're a project manager, if you have a little bit of OCD, and I don't want to I don't want to dismiss or lighten sort of the significance, because OCD is a real thing.
right, it's not fun
It's not fun,
for
right?
the
And I
person
know
who has
something.
it.
All right, I know something about that as well, and so often they go together. And but somebody who's really what you want is detail orientation, but often those two go together, and you
Right.
want, somebody's going to be checking up, following up, is good at that. Now they need the self-awareness to know, like, hey, a certain amount of that is A, unnecessary, B, unproductive, C, annoying as hell, so you need to adapt and adjust. So back to your question about ADHD, well, we were talking about ADHD. The thing about that, or like the gift I see, is you see how the dots connect. Like there's a sprawling kind of, like, where you see a lot of dots, but you see how they connect. And I think this is really valuable.
Do you think that's an ADHD
Yeah.
quality?
I do. I think, I'm not an expert, but I speak mostly from my own experience, and I've read about it. But I think what I notice is that, like, you fall. Let's think of your brain, or really just any conversation like this one, or thought stream of consciousness inside your head, like a tree. Like there's the trunk, and then you go off on a branch, and then that branch has branches, and that has branches and branches. Now it's easy for, like, rabbit holes. It's easy to kind of go up into a branch, and then the key is, can you find your way back down to the juncture there, and go up a different branch? And that's where it can be tricky, because, like, you can lose a lot of time falling into a rabbit hole with ADHD. That's the hyper focus part of it. And there's different kinds of ADHD. There's the combined type and all that. We could get into all that, but the point being that it's not necessarily an ability to focus. I think that's what people misunderstand.
Okay.
It can be hyper focus, in which like you kind of get lost in time, and 4 hours can pass. It can happen easily on the internet, where these click trails, these rabbit holes on the Wikipedia rabbit hole or whatever, or YouTube rabbit hole, where you find yourself, fascinated by a topic. So, this is to your point, like, how does a person like Jordan Peterson, or anybody who's like a polymath, know a lot, or know seemingly a lot about a lot of different things? Is because, like, their brain kind of branches out. They find themselves, anyway, I'll speak for myself. I find myself kind of going, you know, uh, on these branched uh rabbit hole
Right.
trails, and just kind of discovering a lot of things, and it's all fascinating. It's all fascinating, but the key is, to be able to bring it back home and connect it to something meaningful. And that, and that's where I think, you know that's that's another skill that is necessary to be an effective generalist. Not just knowing a lot about a lot of different things, but understanding how they relate to each other. And so that kind of brings me to systems thinking, which is something that is that I really believe in, and I've been studying more and more. There's a book called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. It's a fantastic book. I would recommend it. You might like it. I don't know, do you know much about systems thinking?
No, I don't.
Well, it's worth exploring, let me put it that way. But everything basically is a system. The world is a continuum. There really are no boundaries. We kind of draw arbitrary boundaries around systems, for the purposes of conversation, but those boundaries can change depending on what you're thinking about or talking about. But it's, to me, I've always kind of seen things as being interconnected, and understanding how those things connect and kind of finding the universals in them, or that's kind of the quest for the grand unified theory, or the theory of everything. You know what I mean? Like the one elegant model that explains everything. And I get that hasn't happened in particle physics, and it's probably not going to happen. Who knows? And even when it does happen, this goes back to Hegel, right? Then you have a synthesis, which becomes the thesis, and that splits into the thesis antithesis, and then get that.
Hopefully, keep going deeper or bigger,
or bigger, higher, deeper, wider, and so. But
I appreciate.
It's not that complicated. I was just going to say, like, it is and it isn't, so we're not talking about particle physics here. We're talking about running a business. So I think there's some pretty good frameworks out there, for how to run a business, how to grow a business. And that's kind of what's drawn me to those frameworks.
Yeah. I mean, I know in my experience, and I appreciate you bringing it back to the trunk from the rabbit hole that I took us down.
No, I took it there. I went with you. We went together, Ben. It's okay.
It's a together journey. But I know from my experience, we, whenever I'm in things that there's just lots of details, and I can't see a way to to create some sort of grand theory, or understand how the details are part of a system, that just becomes overwhelming and frustrating, and I lose motivation to study those details.
Right.
If it's just hundreds, thousands, dozens of details, it's just too if I can't see or understand or know where it's part of something systematic, it's just a bunch of details, I lose interest. It's that's why it was actually harder for me to appreciate some of the strategic coach approach to things, because it's like a lot of tools.
Right.
It's just like a list of tools, and kind of know when to apply which one. But because it's also an ever-growing list of tools. But as I appreciated, in a certain way, I appreciated EOS better than that, because entrepreneurial operating system is it's a finite size. It's like it is what it is. It doesn't change. It doesn't really adapt much over time.
It's manageable.
It's just like here's a system or a framework for running a business. You just have to plug the right things into the right places and do the hard things to actually make it happen. That's not easy, but but it creates a system. So I like that.
Well, that's why we need structures, especially if you have ADHD, and it's funny, you talk about like, oh, it's an operations person with ADHD. That sounds like an oxymoron or like a bad combination, But the truth is, you learn how to cope and how to effectively deal with that. And in the primary way is through structure. It's having a structure. And that's where EOS is great, because it simplifies. Again, I just did a post on that. I'll send you a link later. Because I think it's a common problem, whether you have ADHD or not. The point is that people get overwhelmed with the details. And easily. And if you get overwhelmed with the details, if you don't see a structure, it's really hard to get from here to there. Like in your company, if you're, you're trying to figure out how it all works. And the more, on one level, it's really simple, but the more you look at it and then you zoom out and you kind of look, you see how the parts fit together. but then you press on pause and the parts start to move, and it's like, oh, okay, and then new conditions and states arise, and they can be more or less predictable and all that kind of stuff. And then you zoom out, it's like, oh man, this is more complex than I thought, and then you get overwhelmed, and then you just kind of double down on drink more coffee and your current initiatives, like in terms of planning, because you don't really have, like, in order to know, like, we want to go there, you need to first know where you are, like have a really good like current state diagram. I'm a big believer, like if you can't diagram like a process flow of your business as it exists today, you probably don't really understand how it works, and you don't understand the underlying structure. So one way to do that is to do that kind of work and then come out with okay, this is how your business works today. This is where we want to go. How do we get from here to there? And then you kind of roadmap that. Another way to do it though is with a business operating system where it's more like an overlay. Like, you put this overlay on top of your business, and it becomes the structure of your business. Then you kind of align the de facto structure with this overlaid framework, which is dynamic, and then now you have a structured process and a structured system for building your business and growing and getting beyond the usual stuck points,
Right.
the places where people stagnate.
Right. Well, this is great stuff. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the kind of context that we get on generalist versus specialist, and kind of at what places and what stages each one is appropriate or helpful, and sort of what happens if you don't have a generalist, if and when and where you need one, so or need to be one. So really appreciate this, Mark. Thank you so much for making the time in this definitely wide-ranging conversation.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome. I hope it wasn't overwhelming or off point. There's other stuff we could talk about related to
Yeah,
that.
we could go on and on. We could be like Joe Rogan. We could do like 3 hours.
I think what's key is like you need a specialist like in tactical places often.
Right. But
like
to hold it all, but to be the
SEM.
conductor and hold it all together, when you have multiple pieces and parts, that's the parts for which you need a generalist.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And
yeah, awesome.
To try and bring it
appreciate
home, and
yeah.
Thank you. It's great talking. It's fun
Absolutely.
conversation.
Appreciate having you. Thank you for coming on, and everybody else, we will see you on the other side. Thank you.
You're listening to Win Win, an entrepreneurial community with your host, Ben Wolf.